Every table, every night, 4 straight months. No empty seats, just a pub in the Cotswolds, booked solid. The dream every restaurant owner in Britain chases and never gets, but it still lost money. £8,486, 4 months, a 360-space car park, a queue out the door, and somehow in the red. So how does that happen? Stay with me. It isn't bad management, it isn't bad food, it isn't even a mistake. The real reason is far more uncomfortable than that. June 2026. Jeremy Clarkson, sitting somewhere between his farm and his brewery, does something that men who've built empires rarely do voluntarily. He tells the truth about the numbers, not the flattering version, not the one his accountant would have quietly preferred stayed in a drawer, filed somewhere it would never see daylight. The actual figure, an £8,486 pre-tax loss for the farmer's dog, covering its first 4 months of proper trading. And he says it by most accounts without much fuss at all. No spin, no excuses dressed up as explanations, no attempt to bury it in a longer statement about weather or supply chains or the state of the nation. Just the sort of dry acknowledgement you'd expect from a man who spent 3 decades being paid handsomely to say the unsayable on television. The same instinct that once had him telling caravan owners exactly what he thought of them, now turned on his own set of accounts. Here's what makes that admission worth pausing on. Most pub owners losing money would tell you it's because nobody's coming through the door. Quiet nights, empty tables, staff standing about polishing glasses that don't need polishing, watching the clock, wondering if it's worth keeping the lights on past 9. The slow, familiar bleed of a business nobody particularly wants anymore. The kind that ends not with a bang, but with a closing down sign taped quietly to the window one wet Tuesday in November. That is not what happened here. Clarkson was explicit about it. The place was booked out every single day, not most days, not the good weeks, every day. If you know anything about the hospitality trade, and quite a lot of you watching this do, you'll know that full is supposed to be the good outcome. Full is the thing every restaurant in Britain is chasing. The number every publican dreams about on the drive home. Full is meant to be where the profit lives, except it wasn't. And that gap between a pub that is, by every visible measure, a roaring success and a set of accounts that say otherwise, is the entire story tonight. Because what Clarkson has stumbled into, or perhaps walked into, with his eyes rather more open than people give him credit for, is one of the oldest, cruelest truths in British hospitality. One that never makes it onto the enthusiastic reviews or the queue of cars stretching down the lane. Demand and profit are not the same thing. They never have been. And the gap between them is exactly where an enormous number of genuinely good pubs, run by people with none of Clarkson's fame, none of his television deal, and certainly none of his fortune to fall back on, quietly go under every single year without anyone writing a headline about it at all. Let's take the car park first, because it tells you everything about the ambition here before you've even sat down. 360 spaces. That is not a number you build for a village, local, hoping for a decent Sunday lunch trade. That's a number you build when you're expecting pilgrims, people driving 40 minutes, an hour, sometimes considerably more, because they've watched a farm in Oxfordshire on their television and decided they wanted to be part of whatever that feeling was, and they came. By every account, they came in numbers that would make most publicans weep with gratitude. So where does the money go? Start with the staff. The farmer's dog employs 146 people. Let that sit for a moment, because it's an extraordinary figure for a single pub. Most establishments this size might run with a fraction of that. But 146 wages, 146 national insurance contributions, 146 people who need training, scheduling, managing and paying, whether the till is ringing or not. That is a payroll built for an operation of genuine scale. And scale, in hospitality, is expensive in a way that doesn't announce itself on the menu. Then there's the cost of the food itself, and this is where Clarkson's own decisions start working against him in ways he seems to have known were coming. The pub runs on British-only sourcing, not British where convenient. British, full stop. That means black pepper from Cornwall instead of the imported variety, at something like 10 times the price. British beef instead of whichever cut happens to be cheapest that week on the international market. A wine list that, by his own admission, has caused his accountant considerable and ongoing distress. Every ingredient in that kitchen tells a story about a British farmer, a British field, a British season. And every one of those ingredients costs more, sometimes a great deal more, than the alternative sitting one supplier away. Add to that the wider pressures every hospitality business in this country has been wrestling with. Rising energy bills that don't care whether your pub is fashionable. Rising national insurance contributions that landed on every employer in the land at once. A recruitment market in rural areas that makes finding and keeping good staff its own quiet nightmare. None of that is unique to Clarkson. What's unique is that he's running headfirst into all of it, while deliberately choosing the most expensive version of nearly every decision available to him. Put that together, a payroll built for scale, ingredients bought at a self-imposed premium, and a cost environment that's punishing everyone in the trade at once. And you start to see how a pub can be full every single night and still finish 4 months down. Here's the thing about Clarkson, and it's worth understanding properly before you decide he's simply bad at business, or that this is a rich man discovering rather late in life that pubs are harder than they look. He has known exactly what he was doing for rather longer than this June announcement suggests. Sometime before this loss became public, in an interview delivered with the same flat, unbothered confidence he brings to everything else, he described the pub's economics in a way that most business owners would never dare say out loud, let alone on the record. He called it a brilliant way of turning £100 into about 94. Read that again, slowly, because it's easy to skim past just how remarkable a thing that is to admit. He wasn't confused about the maths. He wasn't caught off guard by a loss he hadn't seen coming, the way you might expect from a man discovering too late that pepper from Cornwall costs 10 times what it does from anywhere else. He described the food side of the business, in his own words, as something that loses money more or less by design, before a single account had been published to prove him right. That is not the language of a man who's been caught out. That's the language of a man who understood the shape of this business, right down to the pence, before he ever cut the ribbon or seated a single customer. Which raises the obvious question. Why would anyone build a hospitality business around a food offer they already know loses money? Why deliberately choose the most expensive pepper in the country when a cheaper one sits on the very same supplier's shelf, one aisle over, at a fraction of the cost, and nobody at the table would ever taste the difference? Because the food was never supposed to be where the money lives. The food is the reason people drive 40 minutes, sometimes considerably more, and queue in a car park without so much as a booking, just to say they'd been. The food is what fills the seats, what gives the whole enterprise its reason for existing in the first place. What happens once those seats are filled, and what those diners order to go alongside their meal, is an entirely separate question. And it's the question that actually determines whether this business survives long after the novelty has worn off. This is where Hawkston comes in, and it's worth understanding just how deliberately the two businesses have been stitched together. Every pint of Hawkston lager sold across that bar returns to Clarkson at full margin, not the thin, negotiated margin of a tied house pouring someone else's beer under a distribution deal. Full margin, because he owns the brewery, he owns the pub, and there is no third party standing between the two taking a cut. When a table of 6 sits down for a British-sourced Sunday roast that's losing money with every plate that leaves the kitchen, and then orders 4 rounds of Hawkston to go with it, the food loss and the beer profit are having a conversation the diners never see. Sometimes that conversation ends in the pub's favour. Sometimes, as this particular set of accounts shows, it doesn't quite balance out. And that's really the honest headline behind the £8,486 figure. It isn't proof the strategy has failed. 4 months is a sliver of a business's life, particularly a hospitality business in its first proper trading year, still finding its rhythm, still working out staffing levels against actual demand, still bedding in a kitchen, built around premium British sourcing that takes time to run efficiently. What the figure actually proves is something rather less dramatic and rather more instructive, that even with full demand, even with a car park that never empties, even with 146 wages worth of ambition behind the till, the food side of a British hospitality business genuinely can lose money at scale. That isn't Clarkson being careless. That's Clarkson being honest about a problem the entire industry has been quietly living with for years, and mostly declining to admit out loud. Think about what that means for every other publican in this country who doesn't have a beer brand to fall back on, doesn't have a television show funneling customers to the door, doesn't have the deep pockets to absorb a loss and simply carry on. If a pub with this much built-in advantage can still finish a period in the red, what chance does the ordinary village local have, run by a couple who've sunk their life savings into it and have no Hawkstone-shaped safety net waiting behind the bar? That's the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath this story. It was never really about whether Clarkson can afford an £8,486 loss. Of course he can. It's about what that loss reveals regarding the actual economics of running a proper, fully staffed, quality-driven British pub in 2026. Economics that are brutal, even when every single thing you're doing is working exactly as intended. Now, if you've made it this far, you clearly care about what's actually happening, behind the headlines rather than just the version everyone else is repeating. So do me a favour, hit that like button. It genuinely helps a channel like ours reach more people who love this sort of story as much as you do. Drop a comment and tell me what you make of it. Is this a pub that's about to turn a corner, or a warning sign dressed up as a celebrity curiosity? And if you haven't already, subscribe and tap that notification bell, because we've got a lot more of this kind of digging into Clarkson's empire still to come. Here's what most of the coverage of this loss got wrong, and it's worth untangling properly. The instinct when a headline says Clarkson's pub loses money is to reach for the nearest joke about celebrities who can't run a business. That instinct is lazy, and it misses what's actually interesting here. This isn't a story about incompetence. It's a story about a man who has, by this point, built 4 interlocking businesses out of a single farm: the television show, the farm shop, the brewery, and now the pub. And who understands better than almost anyone in British media that not every part of an empire is supposed to carry its own weight on its own terms? The farm shop turns over more than £1 million a year from a shed with erratic opening hours and famously inadequate parking. The brewery is worth an estimated £75 million, built from barley nobody particularly wanted to buy before Clarkson's farm made barley interesting. The television series cost him nothing to produce and functions as the most effective advertisement British agriculture has ever had. And the pub sits in the middle of all of it, not as a standalone profit centre that needs to balance its own books in isolation, but as the physical place where all of that goodwill gets converted into people, standing in a British field, holding a British pint, having driven considerably further than sense would dictate to be there. Seen that way, an £8,486 loss over 4 months isn't a crisis. It's practically rounding error against the scale of what the pub is actually doing for the rest of the operation. Every one of those fully booked nights is also free publicity. Every table of diners who post a photograph, tell 3 friends, come back for a birthday. That's marketing no advertising budget could buy, delivered by a business that's simultaneously losing a small manageable amount of money on the food that got them through the door in the first place. That doesn't mean the loss is meaningless, or that it can simply be waved away as clever strategy in every instance. 4 months is early days, but it's not nothing. And if the pattern continues without the food side tightening up at all, even Clarkson's patience and Hawkstone's margins have limits somewhere down the line. Businesses that lose money by design still need the design to eventually add up, particularly once the initial burst of curiosity settles into something more ordinary. What he's built himself, in other words, is not a machine that's guaranteed to work forever. It's a bet, a genuinely interesting one, that brand loyalty, beer margin, and a story people want to be part of can outrun a kitchen that loses money on purpose for as long as it takes for the whole operation to find its natural balance. So let's go back to where we started. A pub, fully booked every night for 4 months. A loss of £8,486 sitting underneath all that demand like a stone under a very good rug. The temptation is to see those 2 facts as a contradiction. Proof that even Jeremy Clarkson, for all his fame and all his farming and all his beer, can get the numbers wrong. But that's not quite what this is. What this actually shows is something far more honest and far more useful than a simple story about celebrity misjudgment. It shows that in modern British hospitality, being full is not the same as being profitable. That premium, ethically sourced, genuinely British food comes at a real cost, one that doesn't disappear just because every table in the building has a booking against it. That running 146-person operation with the ambition of a destination venue means carrying overheads that a quiet village local never has to think about. And it shows, most tellingly of all, that Clarkson himself has known this from the start and built a second business specifically to cover the gap the first one creates by design. The farmer's dog isn't failing. It's doing exactly what a loss leader is built to do, bringing people through the door for an experience that costs more to deliver than it earns, in the confident expectation that what happens after the plates are cleared will make up the difference. 4 months in, the maths hasn't quite balanced yet. Whether it does over the next 12 is the real story here, and it's one worth watching, because it's not really a story about Clarkson at all. It's a story about what it genuinely costs right now, in this country, to do British hospitality properly rather than cheaply, and about how thin the line is between a business that looks like a triumph and one that's quietly bleeding, even when every seat in the house is taken. And that, in the end, is the pub disaster nobody quite saw coming. Not because it was a disaster at all, but because the truth turned out to be far more interesting than the headline. A packed house, a genuine loss, and a man who seems entirely unbothered by either, because he built the whole thing knowing exactly where the real money was always going to come from. If you enjoyed pulling this one apart with us, you know what to do. Hit like. It genuinely helps more people find these deep dives into British old money and British business. Subscribe if you haven't already. Tap that notification bell so you don't miss the next one. And drop a comment telling us what you think. Is this a business that's about to find its feet, or a warning the rest of the trade should be paying closer attention to? We read every single one of them, and quite a few of our best ideas have come straight from you. Thank you, as ever, for spending this time with us. We'll see you in the next one.